Easter, a time for fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies. And then there are the weird parts of Easter, like fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies, which is interesting. But what does all this stuff have to do with Easter? And if this holiday is about more than candy and wearing uncomfortable clothes to church and lunch with your relatives, what makes Easter happy?
No matter how you grew up celebrating, or maybe if you grew up celebrating Easter, you'd probably agree that for the most part, Easter is a happy time. It's springtime, the weather's changing, it's sunny outside. We get to do all sorts of cool activities with our family. Maybe for you, it was dyeing eggs together and hiding them. There's usually a lot of candy associated with Easter, so we get to eat candy that we don't normally have. Reese's puts out the Reese Cup eggs instead of the cups, which I think are much better. You get new cool outfits, maybe to wear to church or to grandma's house, in these cool pastel colors that you don't normally wear. And there's just an excitement to Easter, an excitement that really only happens this one time of the year. And what I want to talk about is not only what we celebrate at Easter, but also why that can and should make us pretty happy. But before we get there, let's talk about this one last thing for a second. And I think it needs to be discussed: the Easter Bunny. Doesn't it seem odd to you that Easter is associated with a giant rabbit? Not only that, but a rabbit that has eggs? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And, when I started to think about it, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to a lot of people. As a matter of fact, you may not be aware of this, but there are a lot of pretty scary Easter Bunny pictures that you can find on the internet. Let me just show you a couple real quick. Check this out. So, even though your family probably isn't going to make you get all dressed up and sit down with a giant, scary Easter bunny, I think that we all know that feeling of being scared fairly well. Uh, Fear is something that we all have to deal with, and fear can take away our happiness faster than almost anything else in the world. Just looking back at those pictures, the kids were happy. They probably had candy. They had a new outfit. The day was fun. There was an excitement. And then all of a sudden, fear of this giant and sometimes scarily dressed bunny just took away all of their happiness. And we've all felt some form of fear, right? As a kid, maybe it was the monster in your closet or the one that you thought lived under your bed. And as you got older, you realized that that wasn't the case, that monsters don't exist. Or as you hit middle school, your fears likely transferred to other things like failing classes, being rejected by a group of friends, or maybe being made fun of. For high schoolers, you've probably figured out that you just don't grow out of fear. Maybe as you've started to grow up, your fears have just grown up with you. Like, what is college going to look like? What is it going to look like to join the real world and get a job and start a family? And if we're to boil it down, there's one fear that connects all of our fears together, and it's the fear of death. And when I talk about death here, I don't just mean the physical act of dying. While that is a big fear, I'm talking about the end of something. A lot of our fears just rotate around this idea that at some point, some part of our life may end. Maybe it's the sport team that we're on, and we know that we won't always be able to be on that team. Or maybe it's the hobby that we have now that we know eventually we won't be able to sustain or keep up. Death comes in a lot of different shapes and a lot of different ways. And whether it's physical death or the death of something that we hope for, the fear of death comes down to losing something that we think we'll never be able to get back. And when you think of that way, it's easy to connect almost all of our fears back to a fear of death. And that's because death seems final. And this is probably even more important in the climate that we're in right now. Everyone's afraid right now of this virus that's going around, of the COVID thing, and of having to stay in our homes and not getting sick and protecting the people in our families that may be able to get the virus. But you know what? I think that that's exactly where Easter comes in. Easter comes in right in the middle of our fear of death, and it tells us a very different story. For those of us who follow Jesus, this is the time of the year where we celebrate, where he came to earth, he died on a cross as a criminal, and then 3 days later, completely unexpectedly, he rose from the dead. You see, this was a big deal for a lot of people, including you and me. And it especially changed the life of a guy named Paul. You can find Paul in the New Testament, and he's one of the most famous Christians in history. Apart from the Gospels in your Bible, a large portion of the New Testament was written by this guy. But it's important to know that before Paul became a follower of Jesus, he spent many years trying to scare Christians into leaving their faith. He was actually opposed to Christianity, and the biggest thing that he would use as a threat was actually death. He would tell people that if they didn't give up their belief in Jesus, that he might have them killed. And then, in the middle of this story, Paul actually meets Jesus. He's on the road to a town, and Jesus shows up. Yeah, the same Jesus that used to be dead, but isn't dead anymore, and it changed everything for Paul. Paul's life was constantly in danger after this. Instead of being the one that was chasing after Christians, he was now a part of the Christian movement, and he was being chased after. In fact, he eventually was killed for his faith. He experienced a physical death because of what he believed in. But despite all of that, and here's the good news, Paul seemed to live life without a fear of death. Paul wasn't afraid of dying, and in Paul's letters, we can actually see why. In 1 Corinthians, which is a letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 15:54 through 55, Paul says this. He says, "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" You see, what Paul knew is that when Jesus died and then rose again, he defeated death. And that means that because of the direction of the resurrection, death can no longer defeat us as Christians. We no longer have to fear any kind of death because Jesus destroyed death once and for all. And ultimately, what we celebrate at Easter, the celebration of Jesus dying and then resurrecting again, it means that fear isn't final. You see, if Jesus can defeat death, literal physical death, that means that he can defeat the things that you're afraid of too. And fear sometimes will try to make you listen to it, to obey it. You get stuck in this mode where you're so afraid that fear is the only thing that you listen to. And that's what power is all about. It's about taking control. But fear is only powerful if it can convince you that it's final. And when Jesus defeated death itself, he showed us that nothing we fear is bigger than him, because he showed us that even death wasn't final. That even when we die, there's something more. There's something greater. Even if fear doesn't get the final word, that doesn't mean that there aren't still things to be afraid of. Yeah, we live in a bit of a scary time, and there are things that we should be cautious of, and we should be doing our part to make sure that we don't spread the virus or cause anyone to get sick. But it does mean that you are equipped to handle the things in your life. And you might be more equipped than you actually realize. Paul says it this way in Romans, a letter that he wrote to a church in Rome. Romans 8:11, he says, "The Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you." You see, Paul is saying that the same power that Jesus used to defeat death 2,000 years ago when he rose from the dead is actually inside of the people like you and me who believe in Jesus today. So, let me just ask you a couple of questions. Where has fear been holding you back? What are the things that your fear has been telling you that this is final and it's not going to change and that you can't handle it? And then what steps should you take to prove that fear doesn't have power over you? Where are the places in your life that you can tell your fear, no, you don't get to dictate what I do and how I feel, because I know a man who has defeated death, who has defeated fear, and the power that was able to allow him to do that is the same power that I have in me. Now, I don't know what your fear is. I mean, there are sure a lot of them right now in the world. And I don't know what step it is that you need to take. But I do know this. If you're someone who believes that Jesus defeated death and follows him, then you have his power inside of you. And that's what makes Easter such a happy holiday. So over the next week, the church is going to be sending out daily. On Monday, we'll send out a big bundle, and then each day you'll have some stuff that you can go through leading up until Easter Sunday, the day that we celebrate Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And I would encourage you each day to check in with this. Barbie and I will be putting out videos. We'll also have some guides for you to follow. Each day, just check in. Learn about this story of Jesus and Easter, and learn about how his death means that we as Christians no longer need to fear it.